Hello and welcome to today's permaculture panel. We have an amazing panel here of guests with various expertise levels in all sorts of fields of interest. But today we're going to really focus on water and fluid dynamics. And we have three really interesting guests that a couple have met each other and some are meeting for the first time. So the idea behind panels is that we get together to sort of present what our piece to the puzzle is with each other. And then we all get to sort of converge ideas and see what sort of arises from that, what sort of synthesis we can get. Each of you deserve a full-on bio, but I'm just going to let you introduce yourself a little bit. And briefly, I'll introduce Gerald Pollack. I came across your work, Dr. Jerry, from this book, I think, and a lot of your presentations on the fourth phase of water caught my interest, and then went back to also read and discover your work on cells, gels, and the engines of life, and pretty much watched everything I possibly could of you. Your work has really revolutionized my thinking. Welcome, Jerry, first of all, and where are you coming at us from? And really briefly, how did you get interested in water?
Well, I'm from Seattle at the University of Washington, and um, I got interested in water when I met a mentor. We had been doing work on the molecular mechanism of muscle contraction. I was invited to a meeting conference, and I met this guy, this Chinese guy. His name was Gilbert Ling, and he was talking about water inside the cell, and he was maintaining that water actually was different from ordinary liquid water, and that the water was structured. In other words, that the molecules were kind of stacked. The water molecules were stacked upon one another, just like a crystal, and um, and that's how it started. I got so interested in that because it became clear that if Gilbert Ling was right, everything else is wrong because
Mm.
because modern cell biology is built on the idea that the water is actually ordinary liquid water and not not like a crystal. So we began doing experiments, and before we did the experiments, the book that you mentioned, "Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life," was my attempt to make Gilbert Ling's ideas understandable to the average, you might say, the average scientist, because Gilbert Ling, I mean, as brilliant as he was, he had no capacity to communicate in a way that people could actually understand. So, um, so that's essentially that's how I got started. And then gradually we began doing experiments, and we found that thematically that our results agreed with Gilbert Ling, but there were some really critical observations that we made that I think go beyond what he was talking about, and I've got a bunch of slides to try to demonstrate that, but unfortunately, there's been some technical issues, and I'm not sure how much of it I'll be able to show, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. And thanks again for being here. I would say everybody should get the fourth phase of water book. You did a really great job, I think, of making it easy for any of us to understand, and good pictures and all the graphics really
Oh,
help
thank
it
you.
make sense. So thank you. And really quickly, Zach Weiss from waterstories.com. Where are you coming at us from, Zach? And I should say, I first came across you. We met, I think, very briefly in Fairfield, Iowa, I think, at a Darren Doherty conference. That's where I first met you. And then I sort of followed that you kept up with Sepp Holzer's amazing work with bodies of water and landscapes and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, everybody check out Water Stories. But where are you at, Zach? And how did you get so interested in water?
Yeah, I'm in Montana at the moment, making my way out west for projects this summer. And my story is actually not too dissimilar from Jerry in that, I always had a really deep love for nature, wanted to do something with my life meaningful for nature. And then I came across Sepulcher, and it just everything I dreamed of as a child. And then he was always talking about water because water is the engine that drives nature. And so it very much, through his work, I realized that when we look at how to restore ecosystems, water is 70% of the work. And when you get that part right, most of the work is done already, and it's kind of a downhill climb from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you do really innovative, amazing designs with landscapes that very integrated, very sort of like they look like natural bodies of water and crater gardens and things, but they're highly involved earthwork projects. But by the time you're done with it, it looks like that sort of imagination version of nature that you didn't even know was possible. I mean, it's really, truly breathtaking work. So we'll get to you in a minute, Zach. Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for being here. And Topher, you're all over the place in terms of your skills and interests. It seems to me, and I don't even know how much you love water. I've heard you talk about biochar really
Hmm.
deeply. I've heard you talk about Victor Schauberg very deeply, and I've heard you talk about building with
Yes.
natural materials on Fibonacci spirals and all these types of things. So I've been wanting to talk about all those things with you. But today we're really talking about water. So, where are you coming at us from? Where are you at? And then what's your interest in water? And maybe Victor Schauberg if you want to, but we'll get to that maybe a little bit later too.
Well, hello everyone. I'm coming to you from the northern aspect of the Ozarks in Missouri, and I have a nice little domestead here in Missouri. And but I fell in love with studying about water in Costa Rica. The very first farm I lived on in Costa Rica was a permaculture design farm. It was actually owned by a German couple, and they turned me on to Victor Schauberger and Rudolf Steiner. And I hadn't made my full move to Costa Rica when I got Callum Coates' Living Energies book, and it absolutely changed my life. I read that book cover to cover probably about 10 times, and I just felt indebted to Schauberger. I kind of felt like he was like I felt like I wanted to be his. I don't know how you would say it. Like I felt like I should martyr him in a way because his contributions were so amazing, and I felt like no one took what he did and brought it to life. And I had moved to Costa Rica, and I had started to build domes, and I figured out that his egg shape was essentially the two dome forms that I know how to build and put them together. So my love for water came in the form of water storage, and then in the egg shaped form that he talked about, and then also flow forms. So
Mm.
those two aspects of what the voluminous amount of material that I read of his, those were the two ways that I could contribute with my skill set with building domes.
Amazing, yeah. So we're
Mhm.
here today. The framework is permaculture. I'm not expecting any. I know Zach, you don't really use that word in the work that you do, and sounds like Topher, you're familiar with it. I don't know the degree to which everybody's familiar with permaculture, but to me, permaculture and why I love talking to people like y'all is because permaculture is this filing cabinet that holds all these for me, for my brain, all the sustainable and regenerative solutions. So I'm just like, cool, another one. If I hear about anything that's an amazing solution, makes sense, works with nature and can be used basically by anyone in the world, then it's like, cool, that's slotted into some filing cabinet in my mind called permaculture, right? However,
Mm,
permaculture is also sort of based on sort of science from the 50s, 60s, and 70s as its foundation, as well as, I would say, the study of indigenous land management practices. But the science from the 50s, 60s, and 70s isn't necessarily caught up to the science of the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and beyond. So this is a way for us to sort of revivify and take the science that we understand maybe to the next level. And in permaculture, kind of like you were saying, Topher, water is such a key feature insofar as we want to store it, capture it, slow it, spread it, sink it, utilize it, because it, like you were
yes.
saying, Zach, it's like 70% of the design is getting water right. And I think one of the major things that has changed my understanding of water is Jerry's work and all the subsequent work that
Yes.
follows fourth phase water. So Jerry, without further ado, I'd love it if you could take us through a bit of a presentation. Guys, I don't know how you feel, Jerry, but I'm okay if we have questions as we go, or we can just wait till Jerry's presentation's done and ask some clarifying questions, but whatever you prefer, Jerry.
Your choice, but technical issue. My screen is now blank. It says loading studio, so I can't see any slides right
Okay,
now.
well, hold on. Let me sort of put up the slides really quickly. Let's see if this works. Uh, so now you might be able to see something now. I don't know. Does anybody see that?
No, I see nothing. Um,
See nothing. Does anybody, Zach? Topher, do you guys see this or no?
I can see the slide you have here.
You can't? Oh,
I can.
you
I can
can't.
see it. Yes, it's a go.
It's a go.
Well, maybe Zach, you'd like to present my slides.
What's it saying on your end, Jerry? Is it just
It
still
says
saying
loading
loading or something?
studio, dot, dot, dot.
Loading studio. Was it saying that the whole time or just now?
The past 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Maybe hop out of the room again, and I'm sorry, and then hop back in, and we'll see if we can,
Oh,
if that
okay.
solves the issue.
Okay, so let me.
And since we got a little break here, Topher, I'll just ask you, what is your relationship with permaculture? I've not heard you talk much about it. Obviously, you got involved in Costa Rica with it, but I'm curious, did you take a PDC? Did you study it? What's your sort of relationship with permaculture?
Like everything, permaculture was kind of like I backed into it. I had no idea that I was going to be living on a permaculture farm.
Well,
Uh,
may I try share a screen? Didn't work before, but
Oh, sorry. Yep. How's this
maybe.
look, Jerry? Do you see that now?
Um, well, okay, so let me. Yeah, I see part of it. I see the top half of my slide, of my first slide.
Hey, that's better than what we had previously. Let me shrink
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Now I see the whole slide. Okay.
All right,
So
cool.
so you're going to
All
show
right, so
PDF.
we'll
Yeah.
pause that conversation, Topher, and we'll continue that later. Jerry, take it away and just let me know when you want me to scroll. And we have
Well,
about a half
okay.
hour for you. Okay.
Unfortunately, the videos, and there are a lot of them, won't work in the PDF, I guess. So I
Okay.
apologize because of the technical problem. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the fourth phase of water, and I'm going to show a surprising role of light. Next slide. Um, okay, so question arises: do we really understand water? So, water's been around for a long time. It's a simple molecule. Most people presume that with all the science that has flowed under the bridge, so to speak, we must know everything there is to know about water. And the next 4 or 5 slides are designed to show that we really don't understand water at all. So, next slide.
Mm.
Okay, so here's a question. Why do clouds float? Clouds are built of little droplets of water. And if you were to take a ladder, climb up the ladder to the height of the cloud, and have a pitcher of water with you and pour the pitcher, it'd, it'd come down like a waterfall, but the cloud stays up sometime. Why? And if you don't know the answer, then you don't understand water. Next slide. Now, this one really requires a video, but let me just describe it to you. You take 2 beakers of water, and you put high voltage between the two of them. And when you impose the high voltage, what happens is you get a bridge between these two. And if you move this beaker in this direction, away from this beaker, the bridge persists. And so if you were to see the video, you'd see a so-called water bridge between the two of these. And the bridge would extend out to a few centimeters, and it persists indefinitely. And so, you need to explain that. And how do you explain it? So even the people who are dealing with this don't really understand. Now, okay, next one. If you drop little droplets of water on a container of water, you would expect that the two would merge instantly. But here's an experiment showing that they don't. We took droplets of water, we dropped the droplets on water, and you can see what happens, that the water droplets persist, and they can persist up to easily half a minute before they actually coalesce with the water beneath. And how is that possible? But that's what is observed. And if you don't understand why that could be the case, then you don't understand water, even though you think you might. Next slide. Okay, now here's the frog, the lizard, And this is a lizard that sits on the tree branch. And I heard Costa Rica, and I think these exist in Costa Rica,
Yes.
but they're somewhere in Central America. And they sit on the tree branch and they jump into the water and they walk on the water. The video shows that really nicely. And so they're called colloquially the so-called Jesus Christ lizard because
Yep.
they walk on the water. And how
Yep.
do they walk on the water? So I apologize that the video can't be shown in the PDF copy that's being shown now, but that's what happens. And there's no real understanding. Okay, so this one's my favorite of all. This is a container of water. And some red dye has been added for effect. Get back to that in a moment. So it's basically water with a little bit of dye. And this is a superconducting magnet that sits right behind the water. And when you turn on the magnet, what happens is that the water splits. It moves to this direction and this direction. And you might say the Red Sea split so that Moses could walk across it. This is a real demonstration by a Japanese scientist. And, it leads to the next slide, leads to some serious problems for fishermen. Um, you know, if the sea splits, then fishing becomes rather difficult. Anyway, so what I presented to you, what I've endeavored to present to you, I'm sorry about the videos, is the fact that there are lots of phenomena that exist that involve water, and we don't understand them at all. We have no idea. And so we don't really understand water. This is the guy from whom I got my inspiration, Gilbert Ling. He lived to almost 100 years. Gilbert came to the US from China. He was chosen among young scientists throughout China, and he was in the first cohort of three. There was a physicist who won a Nobel Prize. There was a chemist who my Chinese student, said he also won a Nobel Prize, and this guy who should have won two Nobel Prizes, but he was passed up because he was pretty controversial. Anyway, his main idea is that the water in biology, or in the cell especially, is structured. It's like a crystal. It has order to it, not like ordinary liquid water, which has no order. It consists of molecules randomly oriented and fluctuating, bouncing around on a femtosecond time scale. So next slide, please. So that's when we started. And we wanted to do experiments because his work was so interesting, and it seemed that follow-up experiments were absolutely essential. And so our experimental work was based on a theme that Gilbert Ling had been espousing. And his idea is shown here, that inside the cell, you've got solids, mostly proteins, and the proteins have charges on their surface. And these are water molecules. And the water molecule is a bit like a dipole. It's got positive charge at one end and negative charge at the other. So you can imagine that a water molecule here would be attracted to a charge on the surface, and the opposite here, and so on. And the other water molecules would sort of line up according to that structuring scheme. And he said it's not just one or two molecular layers, which is what physical chemists believe, but actually it could be hundreds or thousands even. And we actually found hundreds of thousands of layers. But the main point is that if you have a region that looks like a crystal, where all the molecules are ordered in some way, crystals usually exclude particles and solutes because if they're pure, they can't have anything that is impure in it. So they tend to exclude them as they form, as the crystals form. And so we tried, next slide, please. Oh boy, this is going to be difficult without the video. Okay, we tried to do an experiment. This is a chamber, and in the chamber we put a gel, and we also here next to the gel we put water and particles, and the particles are little spheres called microspheres, and when we got it to the microscope, this is actually one of the first observations, we did notice that there was a region here that was devoid, completely devoid of these microspheres. And if you could watch thank you, if you could watch the video, you'd see that it's not just this region, but the region grows all the way out here to 50 or 60 micrometers. And we've seen in some experiments up to a millimeter. So this zone, because it excludes the particles or microspheres, we call it the exclusion zone. Um, and the exclusion zone EZ, it's kind of easy to remember if you're an American. If you're a European, EZ doesn't exactly work that way. But later, when we looked at the properties of the water that's in here, and we found that every property we looked at differed markedly from ordinary liquid water, we decided to call it fourth phase water. So fourth phase, easy, same thing. We found, thank you, we found uh, generality. We looked at many hydrophilic surfaces, that is water-loving surfaces, and we found that they generate exclusion zones, just as in the previous slide, and many solutes are excluded. I would like to say all, but we haven't studied all. We've studied many. And so it's true. Next slide. Okay, so I've been alluding to the possibility that this easy water, fourth phase water, is really different from ordinary bulk, so-called bulk water. But is it? And next slide, please. Well, so here's a list of evidence that easy water is physically different from bulk water. And this list was constructed about a decade ago, and by now the list would be twice as long, indicating, or roughly twice as long, indicating that this water really is physically different. So I'm not going to go through all these because mostly it's published and it would probably bore you. But for example, this is the observation and this is the technique that was used. So here, if you look at the third one, just for an example, EZ is not neutral like ordinary water. It has negative charge, typically. And we found out by measuring with microelectrodes the electrical potential or electrical potential difference, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these observations and with their techniques, all of these differ from what you see with ordinary water. So it really is different. And the way it works, I'll explain to you, and I'm going to explain how it forms a charged battery in water. So this is like the gel I showed previously, or polymer or biological surface, and originally this started with ordinary water, and it wound up being an EZ here, and the region beyond the ordinary liquid water here. And by sticking an electrode in here, we found that this has negative charge, not neutral. And we found the complementary positive charges sitting out here. And so if you have negative next to positive, you got a battery. And batteries are capable of delivering energy. So you have energy that is delivered as a result. And the way this forms is kind of shown here in the lower left corner. So some energy comes in, and I'll describe that in a moment. And this is the water molecule, which is the initial condition. That's everything that sits here consists of water molecules. And the energy splits the molecule here. And so you get one fraction of the molecule with positive charge, which winds up out here. And this part of the molecule has negative charge because oxygen is two negative, one, and then you have one positive here. So these parts of molecules gather together to form the exclusion zone, which you see here. And so the two of them are next to one another and they create a battery. Next slide. So as you know, all batteries need charging. And so the question is, what charges the water battery? And it turns out it's light. It's just like photosynthesis in a way. Incident radiant energy. Next slide, please. Okay, and the way we found that, this is an actual result from a student, and the student was looking at a Naphion, which is a hydrophilic material that we use frequently, and usually we see an exclusion zone here and the microspheres out here, and the boundary between the two is um, almost always parallel to the surface that's used for nucleation. But the student saw, maybe he was bored, I don't know. He saw a lamp, a gooseneck lamp sitting next to the experimental apparatus, and he turned it on. And where the region was illuminated, the exclusion zone grew, as you can see here. And so he called me in to show me. And of course, I was excited because we couldn't imagine where the energy came from to charge this battery or to create the separation of charge, to create the exclusion zone. He found it. And then we did formal studies to see which wavelength, because the lamp consists of a series of wavelengths. And we found that the most effective by far was infrared light. Infrared is a wavelength just beyond red. We can't see it, but it's all around us. Next slide, please. So it's all around. Everything is generating infrared energy. And if you were to take an infrared camera, for example, just like a regular camera, but with a sensor that's sensitive to infrared wavelengths rather than visible wavelengths, you get a beautiful image of everything. And that's why the military uses it at night, because since everything is generating infrared energy or infrared light, you can get a beautiful image of the enemy's tanks. Next slide. And so what this is meant to show, but it works better in animation, is that you basically have a small EZ, and if you add extra infrared energy, the EZ extends. And if you remove it, then it goes back to the default state. But there's always a lot of infrared energy around, and therefore you always have some EZ water sitting next to hydrophilic material. But you add more infrared, you get more EZ. Next slide. So the energy for buildup comes from light. And the light is what charges the water battery and actually also orders the water. Next slide. Now, the same thing applies in the cell. So what we found in that book that was mentioned, The Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, the first of two books, is that the cell actually operates this way. I presented evidence. Half the book was filled with evidence that when the cell is quiescent, for example, if you have a muscle cell that's not contracting, and then it contracts, and then it's back again to the quiescent state. In the quiescent state, it's filled with EZ water. The EZ water has negative charge, and therefore the cell has negative charge. And because it has negative charge, it means it has potential energy. It has energy, and that energy could be fed into driving whatever happens when the cell is activated. So it's a potential energy that gets delivered. Most important point is that this EZ can be a source of energy for the cell. We think only about ATP. There have been some challenges to the ATP idea, and this is another possible source of energy for all of our cells. Next slide.
Amazing.
If that's true, then if you put one electrode here in the negative and one electrode in the positive, you ought to be able to drive something like a lamp. And the next slide shows, or attempts to show, but without the video, I'm afraid here you've got some containers, some chambers with Naphion and pairs of electrodes. And this is a switch, and there's an LED lamp behind here, and this is a magnifier. And if the video could be shown, if you flip the switch, you'd see the bright light here. And so this is proof of principle that the theory that I've been presenting to you really does work. that you can get electrical energy from basically water and light. Next slide.
Hmm.
Now, I'm going to give you one example of using this energy in biological systems, and the biological system. It could be any biological system. It could be animals. It could be plants. And we just today, this morning, got news of publication that in plant xylem, the same thing that I'm going to show you is actually working. It's driving the fluid. So
Awesome.
we did the experiment. We took a hollow tube, a tube made of a naphthalene, and put it in the water like this. And the student who did this noticed that there was flow of the water right through and lasting indefinitely. And usually what you need is a pressure gradient from here to drive the flow, but there's no pressure differential here. But you got flow anyway. And I'm going to show you that the flow arises as a consequence of the EZ building up. Next slide. Well, this is we can skip it. It's a video showing how it's done, the experiment, but since no video, might as well skip it. And this slide was meant to show the example of here's a naphthalene tube, and next to the naphthalene, there's an exclusion zone that builds that sends all the particles that had been suspended in the water away from the surface. And if the video could work, it would show that the water, which you can see because of the suspended particles, keeps moving in this direction. It keeps flowing. And the question is, well, is it something peculiar to the naphthalene tube, or is there a generality? Next slide. So
what is naphthalene?
A naphthalene is a polymer. It's a bit like Teflon, but it has charge groups. So we tried creating our own tubes, and the way we did this was we took a polyacrylic acid gel here, and as a gel, first the gel is in the liquid state, and gradually it gels. So while it was in the liquid state, we stuck in a wire, and as it was gelling, we pulled out the wire, and when we pull out the wire, that leaves a kind of tunnel that you see here, and so we take this chunk of gel with the tunnel, and we stick it into a bath containing water and microspheres, and the same thing happens. If you could see the video, it flows in this direction. And we tried a half dozen different gels, and we got similar result for all. So this is actually very general. Then someone said, hey, you think that light is driving all of this? Why don't you increase the light and see? So one of my students went ahead and cranked up the microscope light. And when he did it, he got a 5 times increase in speed, and that's been published too. So we understand how this works. Next slide. And in fact, the way it works is illustrated here. So here's the tube. And we found experimentally that next to the tube, there was an exclusion zone, negatively charged, and the positive charge was here in the core. And the negatively charged EZ is actually stuck to the surface, builds from the surface, and it sticks to the surface. But the positive charges here, the protons or hydronium ions, are suspended in the water. They're free. And as they increase in concentration, they repel each other. And all they want to do is get out of the tube. So they'll go in this direction or in this direction. And if they go in this direction, they'll move out, and new water gets infused here, and the positive charge builds up, and the thing is perpetuated. And that's how it works. And the energy, as I mentioned, comes from infrared light that's coming in and separating the charges. And so this is transducing this infrared light into charge separation and flow. And so what we found, and since I'm limited in time, I'm not going to describe the experiments, but our result was published a few months ago showing that something different from what we all believe. So we all believe that the heart is driving all the flow. What comes unrecognized is that there have been more than at least a half dozen papers in the past century showing that when you stop the heart, the flow continues. Lower velocity, but it continues much lower velocity. And so there's got to be something else that's driving it, driving the flow if the heart is not pumping or pushing. And we found that the same principle that I've described, the flow idea that I described in the previous two slides, is driving the flow. Now, we don't know whether it represents 5% or 95% of the energy driving the flow. That's yet to be determined. But the conclusion is that EZ is at work. The energy from EZ is driving flow, and it's throughout the cardiovascular system. All of your vessels, and maybe even my vessels, are being used to drive flow. So this is one example of the use of EZ in the body, and there are many more. Next slide, please. Many more examples. So I'd like to conclude with two or three slides here. I guess the main point is that we talk about water's phases, and we think of the solid phase, ice, liquid phase, and vapor phase. We found the fourth phase, EZ, and it's kind of viscous and gel-like. And it turns out that the structure of the EZ, which I haven't had time to discuss with you, is not so different from the structure of ice. It's not the same, but it bears similarity. And it turns out experimentally that if you want to freeze water, the current idea is that you go from water directly to ice. And that's brought up a number of anomalies. But it turns out we have experimental evidence that when you freeze water, you go into the EZ as you attempt to freeze it. You first go into the EZ state and then to ice. And if you want to melt the ice, you got to pass through the EZ state into water, and that clears up many of the anomalies that have existed. Next slide. In terms of freezing of water, so the important point, I guess, is that light supplies energy for building of EZ. It's sort of like photosynthesis. First step of photosynthesis involves the splitting of water into negative and positive. It's 100% efficient, and it's powered by light. So what I've demonstrated to you is kind of analogous to that, or it may even be that photosynthesis is one subset of examples of this more general phenomenon. Next slide. I think there's one more, two more. Yeah. Oh, that's the last one. So, yeah, the book, much of what I've presented, it can be found in a book called the Fourth Phase of Water, which has become very popular. So I think I'll end here, and I apologize that I couldn't get the videos to work. Much more dramatic that way, but I've tried to convey the essence.
And you did. That was great, Jerry. And I can even splice in some of the video footage for the archive of this. Just people during the live stream won't see it. But one thing I just want to say from the permaculture point of view, we've often, or sort of ecology point of view, we've often pondered that like tall redwood trees and things don't have. It's like how does the water get to the very tops of those trees under the pressure gradients of whatever's happening in those systems? And it's long been sort of not understood. And I think easy water and infrared light is a similar sort of answer to how the heart is not a pump so much as it is a vortexing system that helps sort of propel things. And
yeah,
Topher can talk about the heart, I think. But have you
Yes.
found any evidence about the trees and moving water up to the high points of trees?
Well, yeah, I think this very same mechanism is at play. And we've actually demonstrated that in a paper that's just accepted for publication 2 hours ago.
Oh, perfect.
We studied xylem, plant vessels, and you can see the same phenomenon occurring in those. And I think this is the way. It's really almost impossible to imagine the pressure if you have just ordinary water sitting in a 300-foot tall tube, which
Yeah.
you can think of as a xylem vessel. The pressure at the bottom of that is enormous, but this can actually circumvent that because flow, pressure, and flow arise from the mechanism that I illustrated in the slides, and I think that is the very mechanism, and it's driven by infrared energy. So, the flow begins in the springtime when there's warmth, and warmth or heat is almost equivalent to infrared energy. So the
Hmm.
tree is getting more infrared energy. It starts to crank up the machine. This flow mechanism is then at work, and the flow mechanism is sending water up to the crown of the tree.
Hmm.
So, good question. I think that's exactly what's at work.
I think so too. Guys, please feel free to ask Jerry any follow-up questions or insights that you have as he was talking.
Well, Dr. Pollack, I just have to thank you so much for your work. I got your book, I think in 2013 or 2014, and it completely finished for me the Schauberger input. Mainly because of the charge differential, because Schauberger was always talking about electricity is temperature differential, and temperature differential will actually create a flow gradient of energetics, as he would say. And so when you showed your easy water and you showed the gels relative to the water that had solutes in it, and that flow would just occur, I instantly knew that that's what was happening in biology and also what was happening in plants. It just makes too much sense. And you'll get a kick out of this, Dr. Pollack. I build temescals, which is a Mexican sauna, and it's Mexican because it's round and it's usually made out of red clay. And everybody that does a temescal in a red clay, in a red, like a traditional temescal, it's like a sweat lodge. You could think of it as like a masonry sweat lodge. The heated rocks will imbue the red clay with heat, radiant heat, right? And then
Yes.
that radiant heat becomes conductive, and they found that red clay, when it's heated, gives off all different levels of far infrared that's healing to our bodies. So for 1,000 years, it's been very well known. Like if you want to cleanse your body, go into a temescal, and but it has to be a red clay temescal. And it's because of that extra infrared that you're talking about is charging the water. So it's just making all of the fluid in your body this EZ, this exclusion zone, this high energy thing that just pushes all the things that aren't supposed to be there out. It's
Well,
really
you
wonderful.
you said it better than I could have said it. Um, yeah. So the red clay, presumably, is radiating certain wavelengths, and those
Yeah.
wavelengths are efficacious for building easy water. So I mean, I think going down to the molecular layer, what's going on in that particular sauna, or any sauna, is you're getting massive amounts of infrared
Hmm.
energy, and that energy is exactly what's needed to build easy water. And your cells need easy water in order to function properly. So um, so there you go. I mean, it's I think a
Magnificent.
fairly straightforward story, um, and
So
It's
good.
simple, and that's the hallmark of nature, right? Is a simplicity to the system that's running on water and light and
Right.
biological proteins. I mean, it's like,
I
okay, that's
believe so.
simple.
Absolutely, the principle is Occam's razor principle. The
Yeah.
principle
Hmm.
simplicity, or it should be called maybe Newton's razor, because Occam was a theologian, and it was actually Isaac Newton who took up his idea of simplicity. He was addressing the existence of God, but Newton thought it was a cool idea. If you got two ideas
Hmm.
in scientific hypotheses, the simpler one is likely to be the correct one, and so
Hmm.
probably should be called Newton's razor instead of Occam's razor. They're a few centuries apart, but a lot of scientists have adopted that principle,
Yeah.
except in the beginning of the 20th century, when quantum mechanics became one of the became evident, these ideas, simplicity kind of vanished from the scientific scene,
Hmm.
because it's basically abstract mathematics. So one needs to question whether maybe there's a limit to to the idea of simplicity, or maybe quantum mechanics is off base. So, at any rate,
Yeah.
thank you for that contribution. Very interesting.
Yeah, maybe there's a limit to abstract mathematics. But Zach, I wonder what your thoughts are. Obviously, you're familiar with Jerry's work. What did it spark in you?
I mean, just amazing. It explains so many things, but I'll tell you, I could not be more excited for Jerry's next book, which is coming, which for me and my work, I think is gonna fill in so many gaps. When we look at, all the climate modeling we're doing, we're learning that the new generation models are now worse somehow in trying to accommodate for clouds than the models that just didn't account for them at all. And I think there's just so much misunderstanding around atmospheric water, clouds, and the water cycle in general and how that works within the atmosphere. That, yeah, I can't wait for it. Just a nice little tease for everybody. I think that's going to really open a lot of doors.
Well, thank you
What's
for the
that book called?
advertisement. It's called Charged, and
Nice.
then in smaller letters, The Unsuspected Role of Electricity in the Workings of Nature. And it deals, there are 4 chapters that deal with weather. And what I attempt to do, I don't know how successful I will have been, but I try to build up the idea of starting from first principles of physics and chemistry and building up to weather patterns, uh, why it rains, what keeps the cloud up there, how you explain hurricanes, how you explain tornadoes, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a
Nice.
linear approach, starting from the basics and building up. So
That's amazing.
I hope it makes some contribution, but it's got more to it. It deals with other phenomena that we think we understand, but I believe we don't really understand. For example, gravitation is discussed. A few chapters on that. How birds fly. You think you understand it, but uh, I argue that there are observations that are simply in absolute conflict with your understanding. And that also applies to how planes fly, which surprisingly, the experts admit that we really don't understand it. Um, it's
We
there
don't
was
know. They just fly
well, they do fly most of the time. I'm in
most of the
Seattle,
time.
and it used to be Boeing's home, and there's some problems right now that are existing. But um, there was a Scientific American article, and it was written by the acknowledged experts in the field of the physics of flying. And the title was something ordinary title, Flying of Planes, but the subtitle in Scientific American, not known for its radical views at all, was "We really don't understand how planes fly." From the experts, the ones who really understand, or and so I deal with that. I also deal with
Great.
um, why the Earth turns every 24 hours, um, and other phenomena that we don't ordinarily talk about. We just sort of assume, but what we assume is actually in conflict with the evidence. And so I deal with all of those. So thank you for the advertisement, Zach. it'll be out. It'll be out in about 4 months. It's in the final stages of production, and the limiting factor
Excellent.
on this has been my artist son. He does. He's a really gifted artist, and he illustrates all my books, the art. And he was busy remodeling his home for 3.5 years, and during that time,
Oof.
nothing got done. His house got done, but my artwork. So there are
Yeah,
a few books pending right now. It
that's
seems
great.
that I write faster than he remodels.
Mhm.
There's a couple questions here I think that are good ones. Is easy water present in mycelium? I would assume so, since that's a protein
Well, yeah,
structure.
the easiest anything that's living, and if you look at the mycelia and look at the flows, I think the flow there is just pretty much the same as the flows I've been talking about. Which I'm sorry, the videos didn't work, but they illustrate the flows vividly. But sure, it's there.
Yeah. Yep.
And
And then one more. Does the iron present in hemoglobin contribute to easy charge potential / blood flow? Those are good questions. Thanks, Stellian.
yeah, um, 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 I'm thinking about how to answer that. Um, um, because I have a manuscript that is now under review, and I should have been published, but still under review, talking about that. And so, the question is, what does hemoglobin actually do in the red blood cells? And the question is a little bit, you might say, broader than the one you asked. And so, the theme in the manuscript that I wrote is that it's not really oxygen that goes from the alveoli in the lung into the capillaries that are on the outside. It's not that at all. It's actually electrons drawn from the oxygen. And I give a bunch
Hmm.
of reasons why I think that that's the case. And I guess I think the reasons are cogent reasons and convincing reasons, and so the body needs electrons because electrons build easy water. We found if you inject electrons into liquid water, you get easy water from that. Um, and so I think that's what the body needs and what the body does. So it draws electrons from the oxygen, and then those electrons are stored in the red blood cells. And obviously, iron is critical for the hemoglobin that exists there. And so I didn't mean to make this a discourse on that idea, but I think the idea is cogent. If you think about fish, you know, you think, well, fish should need oxygen, right? Because the fish need to, uh, the fish has muscles too, and the muscles need to be fed. And we think the energy comes from oxygen, which eventually leads to ATP and high energy phosphates and such. But the fish that are swimming down below, a few miles below, um, there's not much oxygen that's dissolved in the water. So what those fish do is that they take in water through their mouths and they expel the water through their gill slits on the side. And those gill slits actually contain positive charge that's been measured. It's not neutral like the
Cool.
water that's taken in. And
Hmm.
if they expel positive charge, there must be negative charge somewhere, and or electrons, and that's what the gills do. The gills
Hmm.
extract electrons, and the fish supplies electrons to its body. So this is another example, or an example of a case where it's obvious that there's not a whole lot of oxygen, and yet the fish survives perfectly well. And a reasonable hypothesis is it survives because it draws electrons, just like we draw electrons. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I hope
I
it's.
love it. And I know, Topher, you'll be able to double tap onto that whole idea when we talk about Schauberger. But first, maybe let's switch over to Zach. If you want to present, Zach, we'd love to see some, this is the type of permaculture work. And again, I don't mean to put permaculture on you, Zach, but it's earthworks. It's like building something that's beautiful and functional for clients, for yourself. Like it just gets many of us very excited about the work of permaculture or whatever it is that you call it. And maybe we'll start there, Zach. What do you call your work with the land? And you don't have to like slag permaculture, but you're welcome to. But why don't you use the term permaculture?
Um, that's a great question. So I call it water cycle restoration. And I'll say, I have a huge amount of appreciation for permaculture. I've learned a lot through permaculture, but it is also different than permaculture. And while the on the ground results can look quite similar, the way to get there is quite different.
Hmm.
So just because of that, and I'll say I think permaculture is something that people have a very strong response to, both positive and negative. And so we try and present everything in a way that people of any belief system can really grab onto it and appreciate it. So similarly, we don't mention climate change a lot because we don't really need to mention it to solve a lot of the ecological problems we face. And then by not mentioning it, we also bring in people who don't think that's a big issue. So
Right.
some of these more hot button, triggering words, we just find it's better to kind of avoid and speak to the core human values that most people hold.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Should I take it away here? Are you seeing the slides okay?
Yep. Yep. I'm seeing it. Looks great. Take it away.
Awesome. So thanks everyone who's watching this. This is what I'm really excited about, earning a living, healing Earth. I think a lot of us know how many problems we face in the world today. And I think if we're only doing the solutions in our off time, it's really hard to make a meaningful change. And so I'm hugely appreciative for, having gotten to see the results firsthand. I got to have a great apprenticeship with this man, Sepp Holzer, who just really rewired my brain in terms of what's possible with land and water. And you can see these projects that he's done, like this community in Portugal, that went from not having enough water to survive there as a community to having plenty of water. And this is only with the water from the sky, the waters that's freely available to us from nature, and how we interact and steward that. So I got the opportunity to work with him very intensely over a number of years, a lot of times being the person in the machine doing the things. And so it really helped me understand how to implement these types of solutions. This is his farm, the Krameterhof, which when I first heard about it, it was just the living manifestation of everything I dreamed of as a kid. People really living in tune with nature, producing all their food, fuel, medicine, everything they need from a landscape, in a landscape that's also very healthy and productive for the surrounding greater wildlife, not just for our human systems. So here's a fruit tree falling over with the weight of its own productivity, loaded with apples, loaded with grapes, and this is with no fertilizers, no compost, no outside inputs, just by partnering with the natural forces. And so while water wasn't the focus at the beginning, he really instilled in me how water is the blood of the earth. It's the thing that we first need to focus on. And then learning about the water cycle. We all hear about the big water cycle in school, but there's all these smaller cyclings of water that are very critical to what we experience. And so everything from the temperature of the soil when the rain falls on it to the coverage, how that water moves through the earth and comes back out, and even the process of turning water vapor into rain, these are all processes heavily driven by biology. And so, in the natural state of the landscape, we have this healthy, balanced water cycle where water is drawn in through the continents. It cycles many times in the small water cycle before it continues out to the ocean in the bigger water cycle.
Mm.
What we do to this beautiful, intricate, and yet simple system is we create this watershed death spiral. We clear the land, we harden it, we, in that process, divert all of the rains downstream, creating flooding. But then, because that water didn't go in, we also have drought as a result. Then, with all these hot, barren, open landscapes, we get these rising hot air and high pressure domes that push on the incoming maritime humidity, resisting it until it eventually overwhelms and you get bigger, more powerful storms than ever before, with longer periods of drought in between, and then with fire. And so we're very much creating this cycle of flood, drought, and fire that we experience today. If you look around the world over the last 10,000 years, human activity has desertified 1/3 of all of Earth's land. The Middle East, Northern Africa, Australia, the Tibetan Plateau, the American West. We're working on South America currently. And so we've really had this huge impact on the landscape that we really don't even measure. By some estimates, we've lost 87% of our wetlands globally. And we didn't lose them, they were destroyed. They were drained, they were dredged, and even in places where we have, what's considered innovative, forward-thinking legislation, like the California Sustainable Groundwater Act, if you look at the actual targets that they're aiming for, to them, sustainable groundwater use is 50% of all of the wells in the state going dry. And so I think we're just setting the bar way too low. And, you look at where was this 87% of wetlands that were lost, a lot of it has turned into cities. And when we turn these landscapes into these hardened features, it not only drains the water that hits that surface, but in all of the mountains around that area, that water is fed to this valley that used to be an extent of wetlands and water systems. And so all that water is drained away as well. And so what you get is a totally different hydrograph where you get these spikes in flow, these long periods of drought, and you're creating a situation with flood, with the erosion, the risk, the cost, the insurance, the finance. And then because you've created the flood, you're also creating the drought and the fire with that associative costs and risk and insurance and erosion. Whereas the alternative, when you have water that's really in that full healthy water cycle, you have some runoff, but a much smaller portion. And so you have water slowly moving through that ecosystem, meaning that the photosynthetic period is much longer, and you have 590 calories per gram cooling happening as that water is moving through that ecosystem. And so we see with these high pressure heat domes, we're getting more and more of these incredible flooding events that are causing all sorts of issues. But then also in the very same year, we're having these droughts and fires. And so they're really two sides of the same coin that's causing immense issues all around the world in the form of these three challenges that are all very much by choice. And so what we do is water cycle restoration, where we're really reversing this process of the watershed death spiral, and we're resolving flood, drought, and fire through partnering with nature. And so this can take a lot of different forms: earthen water bodies, terracing, infiltration basins and check dams, leaky weirs, beaver dam analogs, contour trenches, biological enhancement. There's a lot of different tools in the toolkit that all help build this small water cycle function. So a lot of times we're coming in with big equipment and big machinery that in areas where water has been drained and destroyed with big equipment, it's really hard to undo it with a shovel. And so we'll come in, we'll restructure the earthen resources that we have so that these landscapes can really hold on to water. And so, for example, this is a community that used to have a road going up where the water should be, draining this whole valley. And so they were running out of water because they were draining it all away in the 1 month where they have heavy rains and then suffering drought the rest of the year. By changing that road that had been a previous impairment to this landscape, now they're storing that water, feeding it back into the earth, and have plenty of water for their community once again. And so
Beautiful.
we can really be a positive impact on our landscapes and on our ecosystems. We can use this technology that we have to create really healthy landscapes that produce not just for humans, but for our non-human brothers and sisters all around the world that are just pushed to the edges. And so I really think, we're always talking about reducing our environmental footprint. I want to have the largest environmental footprint possible
Yeah,
because I
that's my
know our
man.
footprint can be positive or it can be negative. And if we're just focusing on having a less negative footprint, we're never even going to have a neutral footprint. And so I view it as part of our responsibility to use some of the technology that we have accessible today to undo a lot of the damage that's been done by previous generations. And if you think, most of us are not going to stop driving on roads and living in homes and all of these hard surfaces force water away, and we can instantly rebalance that with some of these techniques. So here, this is a rain-fed pond that captures and stores the water coming off of the roof of the home, off of the roads, and helps balance out the impact on the water cycle that this family has. And they create beautiful ecosystems where, you have waterfowl coming through, it produces fish, it provides a nice swimming area. So you can really make features that are ecologically beneficial and also very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing to the people who live there. And you can accomplish things in an amazingly short period of time. In this one project, for example, in just a couple of years, this spring is now flowing 20 times what it used to be in the summer. It was typically down to half a gallon a minute or less, and it now flows 10 to 20 gallons per minute through the summer and year round. And so there's this real feedback loop of success that happens when you work with water. And I think this is nowhere better illustrated than another one of my mentors, Rajendra Singh in India, where they started 35 years ago, very small, doing the work by hand of helping communities revive the traditional water management practices in the desert of Rajasthan to hold that water. And so I'll show you just one community. This was a community that was out of options, all the young people leaving, really no viable future. And then this is the feature that they created there. So they went from
Whoa.
9 hectares of agriculture to 650 hectares of agriculture. They paid for the cost of this feature 4 times over the first year in their increase in agricultural productivity.
Wow.
Wow.
So you can see they pay for themselves quickly, and then this feature will continue to produce for this community for generations as long as they maintain it. And so this means instead of getting one crop a year in the monsoon, they're getting two, three, sometimes even four crops a year because they're holding on to that water.
Mhm.
And what's really important is they're building these features in areas where they actively recharge the ground. They're looking for the vertical fracturing within the ground so that they can get that water away from the sun into the ground to recharge the shallow aquifers in this region. And so it's producing viable economy for the people living there, but it's producing incredible impacts for the watershed. They've now revived 9 rivers in this area, and 250,000 wells that were dry now have water once again. And so, in addition to those 9 that they've revived, they've rejuvenated and helped 13 rivers in the region overall. They've raised the water table 5 meters in some areas. They've revegetated, they've increased their crops, and very interestingly, they lowered the temperature by 2 degrees Celsius in this region.
Yeah.
And so
Big deal.
it's an amazing story. You can find Reviving Rivers is a film that we made, and we also released a newer one where actually people went from being bandits to farmers through this water work as well. And this is just one story of so many from all around the world. And this is really why we created Water Stories, is there's so many hopeful stories from each corner of the world that people just have no idea about. And so
Mhm.
we make films about these stories. We run trainings and uh, certification programs, and we really have an incredible amount of content just freely accessible to anyone. So if this stuff seems interesting, very much recommend check out waterstories.com. We have these nice animations that show what happens in the water cycle. We have full films, all sorts of different things. And it's been really incredible that in just a few years, we have users in probably more than 200 countries now. This is a little dated. When we've reached multiple people in 170 countries around the world. So it's been really hopeful to see how people gravitate to this new story as we try and build a new paradigm around water and specifically how we manage the water that comes on land. So
Hmm.
now our community, again, old figures, our community is more than 6,000 people all around the world, really interested and working in this area. So it's a great place to connect with others and learn what they're doing, what challenges they're facing, how they're overcoming those challenges, so that we can all be stronger by working together. This is one of my favorite quotes from Goethe. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing
Mhm.
is not enough, we must do. And this is, I think, where we really focus. And one of the things that, I why we don't use the word permaculture a lot is permaculture is very heavy in the knowing and the theory, but less so in the practice. And what I learned from SEP is you really can go practice first. And you don't even need the theory if you do the practice, observe, and learn from your practice. So it really comes
Hmm.
down to getting those skills in your hand, building them up within yourself. Because when we put our hands in the soil and do this work, we can make really incredible results. And so this is what we're aiming towards, reviving the water cycle. How do we work with our built systems in a way that we can help offset and reverse this death spiral and really recharge water back into the landscape to help feed this balanced, healthy climate? And it makes really beautiful, nice features to interact with. If you do it for nothing else than to just have a nice, beautiful oasis, it makes sense. And then you're also creating this larger positive impact.
Yeah.
And when you do this for your career, I cannot tell you, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I travel around meeting incredible people that care deeply about nature and our planet and are doing everything they can to have a positive example. And we get to help these people realize their dreams with their property. And so this is our training program where we take people through all the steps that I needed to do this as a profession. It makes a lot of sense if you want to do this work professionally. I think it's the best way to get started. If you want to do this work on your own place as a steward, it also really helps. And there's also a really important role for advocates in this work. Maybe you're living in the city, you don't have your own place to implement this, but in those cities, that's where governance is and where decisions are made and where we need these powerful advocates for water and nature to be present. So
Hmm.
we take people through a whole growth experience. And it's been really amazing. Even as hopeful as I was when we began, it has exceeded my expectations by a huge amount. The number of people now doing this work professionally around the world in just, 6 months to a couple of years blows me away. And teaching workshops, helping other people in their communities. We have so many different examples, but here's one where from the work that they did in a very harsh situation, already they have a seasonal spring on their land that they've created, and their well has come up 3 meters already.
Dang.
And this is
Oof.
just in, under a year's time. And so I really fear that the modern environmental movement has hitched their cart to the wrong horse. Everything is so carbon centric. We just have carbon tunnel vision. And this is something where if we implement all the solutions right away, we won't even know if it's working for 20 or 50 years. People who do those changes never really reap the rewards. It's future generations. Whereas when you work with water, you see the results in the first rain. You see the results in the first dry season after that rainy season. And so it really enables people to get excited about it, to see how beneficial it is, and to create movements around it. And I'll say also, a lot of times people take this the wrong way to say that carbon's not important, but I use this rather to highlight how important water is. When we look at the heat dynamics on Earth, 2/3 or more are regulated by water, whereas less than 1/3 is regulated by carbon. Now you'd think, how can that be? I'm hearing about carbon all the time. Well, for one, water is much more present in the atmosphere, 2 to 50,000 parts per million versus 420, as 5 times the specific heat, meaning the amount of energy required to change its temperature. And then in addition to that, it exists in these multiple phases with this huge energy transfer in between each of those phases. So it's very challenging to model, it's very challenging to understand, but it's very important nonetheless. And so we see that when we work with water, we have this incredible speed of impact and rate of return that really helps us.
Hmm.
And so you can see, when we start messing with the thermal regulation of our planet, we're naturally going to have temperature extremes, climate extremes, and these work in a feedback loop. As we aridify places, we have less biology, we have less precipitation in a regular fashion as a result, and it's this downhill spiral. Now, in the reverse, we also have these feedback loops that help us climb out of it. The more water we put into the land, the more vegetation grows, the more carbon sequestration, the more transpiration, and the more precipitation as a result. And, as much as this is new stuff, it's also very old stuff. You can go back more than 2,000 years ago, and Plato was talking about the relationship between an excellently attempered climate and the health of the landscape. And so to me, this is really incredible that you can go back this far and they're saying, by screwing up the landscape, we screwed up our climate.
Hmm.
And, so this is something that arguably we've known for a very long time. And fortunately, we have the solution. We have the solution where we take one step forward and nature takes the next 10 steps forward. And we just need to get it started in the right direction. So, one of these newer concepts is the biotic pump and bioprecipitation. How ecosystems actually draw water in through continents, control moisture transport through continents, and then also with this bioprecipitation, uh, for water to condense into clouds and droplets, it needs a precipitation nuclei. Now, there's biological, there's ice with orographic lift at extreme temperatures, and then there's these inorganic materials as well. One of the things that I think is really important to understand is you see on the left side, all of the organics work at much warmer temperature ranges than all of the inorganic particulates. So we actually see not only are they safer, but they're also more effective because not only do they work at higher temperature ranges to incite freezing and then precipitation, but also then when it rains, you get this inoculation of these bacteria that then regrow, that then make rain even more likely. So I think this process is really not appreciated enough. And if you look at a place like South America, in breaking this biotic pump, we're also increasing the amount of energy in the ocean. We're increasing the persistence of extreme hurricanes in other regions. And we're also aridifying the southern portion of the continent because that depends on the Amazon forest drawing in moisture, cycling it 7 times, and leading to that green zone that you see further south along the Andes in the continent. And so by clearing the Amazon, we're not only aridifying that place, but we're aridifying other places as well. And when you look at the Amazon, 50 to 80% of that precipitation is driven by these bacteria and biology. And so when you lose that, this ecosystem could not just become a savanna, it could actually become a desert potentially. And we've done this in other regions of the world. So we have this incredible ability to work with these natural systems where water cools, vegetation cools as it transpires. It actually absorbs heat, transfers it up higher into the atmosphere, and then if that condenses, it actually releases that heat in a wavelength that can dissipate out into space. So we have all the tools that we need to regulate the problems and challenges, or at least a lot of them that we face. We can also extend the photosynthetic growing period. So instead of 20 days after a rain, things are photosynthesizing, it's hundreds of days after a rain that they're photosynthesizing.
Mm.
Uh, and so we really have the ability to make these lush, beautiful, healthy places. And so this is why we created Water Stories. You can join the community to learn a lot more. You can check out our courses, which are really in depth. We're also having in-person training experiences. We have an advanced course that runs once a year and a self-paced essentials course that you can join anytime. And we're really trying to do more in-person workshops, both for people who have already done our courses as a deep dive, and also for people new as a beginning introduction. And we're starting our global tour as well this year, where we'll have a lot of workshops in Europe and Africa, and then moving to South America at the beginning of the new year. So I just want to really instill in you guys that we have all the solutions to the biggest challenges that we face. And especially if you're looking for a career in doing something positive for nature and people and planet, working for water is just such an important area. You could not go better. In a way, it's really concerning that water work is becoming so big because it means that water scarcity is becoming a huge issue. But major players from, the United States Department of Defense to foreign governments are really looking at these techniques as a way to face some of their most pressing challenges that they have today.
Dang, tour de force there, Zach. That was awesome. Yeah, you partner
Incredible.
with nature, you can't go wrong. You partner with water, you're kind of on the cutting edge. I'm curious what, Jerry, if you had any thoughts vis-a-vis the work that you have uncovered and how it relates to water bodies and ponds. And if not, that's okay. Topher, I'd love to hear from you too.
Well, yeah, I had a few thoughts. First of all, congratulations, Zach. What you're doing is truly amazing. And as you were speaking, I had a few thoughts about other possible sources of water, and I presume you know about these, and I wonder if you have any comment. The first one is about primary water, um,
Mhm.
uh, which exists something like 500 miles beneath the surface of the Earth and has been estimated in quantity to be 3 times more than all the oceans on the surface of the Earth put together.
Crazy.
I'm not aware of how that estimate came about, but it seems that there is primary water down there. And I'm just wondering if you had any comments. That's the first of two. And the second one was from Wilhelm Reich, the cloud buster. You're
Mhm.
familiar with that? Yeah. So so there's a guy. His name is Majid Abdul Aziz, or something like that, and he's actually trying to create using the right cloudbuster to create a green zone that runs east west across the Sahara Desert, and
Right.
he's partially succeeded. It's only a very small fraction of the entire belt, but he shows pictures of what he's been able to achieve, and the cloudbuster itself is really interesting. I know there are a few people who have adopted or tried to adopt it, and
Topher being one of them.
so he's got his apparatus and he aims it at the sky, and it creates clouds and it creates rain where otherwise there would be no rain. And the idea is to create that green belt, and so the people who are attempting to escape from the poverty ravaged areas of Africa, they go north toward Europe, and the idea is and the Europeans are not so fond of all of those immigrants. And the idea is that if they travel north, they run into this green belt, and they have all the fruits and vegetables and whatever that they can ever need, and they stop. They don't go any farther north to Europe. So so these are a couple of possible sources of water, and I just wonder what you're thinking about this, if anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I both areas that I'm quite fascinated by and always digging more into. I think the latter really folds well into working positively with this work. And it's interesting that you mentioned migration, because one of the things that happened in India was the reverse migration, where people had migrated away from these areas, and then when they became green, they returned home because they didn't want to be migrants. They just
Sure.
didn't have another choice. So I think it's something that I've been digging on and want to start experimenting more with. Um, the primary water piece I find quite fascinating, and at the same time, I find it a little concerning that just from the standpoint of, I think some people take it as a reason to say, oh, we don't need to steward the water that we have because we have an infinite
Right.
supply and we could just go get more. And I think most of the people are not thinking about that, but I do see some people take that and run with it in that direction. And I always think about, how do we work with the cheapest water first? And the
Yes.
cheapest water is the freely provided from the rain, and then the surface overflow, and then the springs and shallow aquifers. And as we get deeper and deeper, it gets more expensive to work with that water. Sometimes you need to, and sometimes it can be really beneficial. Um, but I'll say I've had enough friction with people that say, "Oh, we don't need to conserve water on land because we have plenty of water in the earth." And I think whether it's true or not, it's easiest to just work with the simplest, most natural solutions, which I think the cloud busting can very much fold into that as well. And I can see places where the primary water would have some good use. But I think there's a foundational old water paradigm instilled in people from I don't know how long ago. But essentially, when we were defecating in the streets, standing water meant disease. And so, as part of development, you get rid of water. And
Right.
now we have better ways to manage our sanitation, but we have the very same approach with water. And so, I
Mhm.
look at a lot of this as how can we change that approach where we look at water as this incredible resource to be kept and held on the land.
Mhm.
Um, I think that that's just sometimes the easiest, cheapest way to solve the problem.
Sure, sure. That
Absolutely.
makes sense.
Yeah, Topher, anything that you wanted to ask Zach or double tap on?
Oh, well, one, you're doing God's work, Zach. I mean, this is amazing. My teachers in I loosely call it permaculture and biodynamics, just because that's the terms, but they were all into water retention. So to give you an example, right now on my current farm, my well is at the very lowest part of my farm, but I have a ram pump system. So I went ahead and sourced old 7,000 or 5,000 gallon water, all metal water tanks from the city of Springfield, Missouri. I bought them on auction for $500 a piece,
Wow.
quarter inch metal. So now I'm ram pumping, which for those of you out there that don't know what a ram pump is, it's a cavitation pump, which reverts back to what we were talking about with the heart and circulation. It uses cavitation as a way to move a fluid. You know, for this type of ram pump with the flow that I have, I can push the water about 20 meters, about 62, 63 feet higher than where it is. But my property, the very high ridge of my property, is only 20 feet higher than my well.
Hmm.
So this water is going to go up to 10,000 gallons of holding, and then I'm going to distribute that. I already have one pond dug. I'm going to build a secondary pond to slow the water down. Because right now, we actually bought this property because I drove over the spillway of the well. And the second I drove over the spillway, I was like, "There's water," and I was so
I
excited.
know what that
But
is.
it was, but it was at the very bottom of the property, and they're just letting it go into the man-made lake. And I'm like, we're gonna use that for a trout pond. We're gonna use that for a secondary pond. We're gonna use that for a catchment basin at the top of the property. And so I'm totally like everything that you're doing is so awesome because that in this particular area of the world, it used to be the savanna and prairie, but they got rid of all the prairie grasses and the prairie wildflowers that would retain the water in the soil for grasses like fescue that the cattle would eat year round or more into the winter time. So now the land doesn't have the water carrying capacity that it had for God knows how long, right? And so we just met with North Hamilton Outpost this last Saturday and got totally coached up on how to bring in the natural wildflowers and the grasses here to help retain water in the soil. And that makes, and I make a lot of biochar. And so like giving biochar to the ground along with all the wildflowers should really help with the retention of water.
Yeah,
And
there's
one of the
two.
big
Go ahead, Zach, please.
one of the big things you touched on there that I think is a great way to summarize this is it's not so much about how much water you get, but how many times you use it before it leaves.
Exactly.
And can you
Yes,
reuse the same water through living systems? Like the Amazon cycles 7 times before it continues down the river. And so the more we can model that, the healthier our ecosystems will be.
definitely.
And then I think the cutting edge with Jerry's work is like, how can we apply some of these like tube structures into our tanks or before it gets into our homes so that we're drinking structured water, easy water, or
Exciting.
into these ponds that you're building, Zach? Like, instead of having pumps, can we replace with some type of tube that's like near the surface so it's receiving the light? And like, I'm curious how these systems can integrate, and I don't know if anybody has experience with these ideas. And then the other one being, of course, the energy battery coming from the water. Can we actually start to pull energy from these bodies of water that Zach and others, Topher, you're building and I'm building, and turn it into some type of storageable energy system for these off-grid, permaculture type communities?
It's
Well,
a brilliant idea. I don't think anybody has really attempted to implement it, but it could turn out to be practical, and needs.
Zach,
I,
you're well positioned, my friend.
Well, and I'll say it's the number one reason I'm excited to get a place is to start experimenting with this very thing. Because when I'm
Yeah.
working for clients, I have to do what's proven and what I know and what works. But
Right.
I like experimenting. By nature, I'm a scientific mind, and so I look forward to being able to, start playing with some of these questions once I get my
Yeah.
own place to work with.
Yeah, one of the
Well,
best
let's
experiments. Can I jump in on that with the experiments
please, please.
with getting energy directly from the water? When I first read Schauberger, or when I read Callum Coates talking about Schauberger, he highlighted Lord Kelvin and Lord Kelvin's lightning maker. And essentially, what that machine did was it essentially took water from one basin and it separated it into two streams that would drop, and they would drop through two rings that were conductive, but those two conductive rings then were attached to an insulated container at the bottom where the charge would then you would end up getting a similar charge trying to make its way into itself. So the
Hmm.
positive would start to resist itself and the negative would start to resist itself. And what would occur then is you'd start to build a field of electricity from that. And what he would do is he would have two other nodes where that charge, as it would build, it would discharge, and he called it his Lord Kelvin lightning maker. Because
Hmm.
for every millimeter of little zap that you got, like we all feel that when we have static electricity, I think that's something like 10,000 volts. It's like an amazing amount of voltage. So the whole thing that I did with that was I actually just put diodes on that so it wouldn't fully discharge the system.
Hmm.
Like you can build that machine, and there are people, and I am not an electrician. I'm just an experimenter. I'm just a dude that sees something and gets excited, and then I'm handsy. I'm sure an electrician could figure it out, or an electrical engineer could figure it out where the discharge nodes, they would have a series of diodes so that there wouldn't be a full discharge. So your cycle of, voltage collapse, maybe you could get it to 50 hertz, 50 cycles per second. If you're getting 50 cycles per second,
Wow.
say at 110 volts, guess what? Now your water, just falling water using the charge differential in the water, as Dr. Pollack showed, the water is the battery. Lord
Hmm.
Kelvin showed this with his lightning maker. He literally showed it, I think, in 1875. Like, this has been around for 150 years. It's just a matter of knowing how to engineer the structure so that you could get it to discharge at a rate that is something that modern electronics would use.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we could go on and on, but Topher, I would love for you to give us a bit on Schauberger, what that means to this conversation, and really quickly, a question for Dr. Pollack. Uh, Stellium7 just wants to know if you're familiar with Francisco Torrent Gauss related
Quas.
to the heart.
Yes, I
Okay, so
am.
you must be. Okay,
Yeah.
I assumed yes. Okay, so that out of the way, Topher, please take us through whatever you got. We're just excited to hear it. And if anybody has a hard out and you have to leave, just leave when you got to leave. And thank you guys. This has been a really stimulating, great conversation.
Oh, this is so upsetting. It won't allow me to share it. I thought I had figured it out, and it's still
Oh,
not allowing me to share it.
yeah, well,
Uh,
keep
Uh,
playing with that. Zach, I'll ask Zach a couple questions here, because we got a couple in the chat. The first question was more of just a statement. Hey, your work is good work. There's a lot of considerations that goes into water cycle restoration, and I agree with that. And that's why I imagine your course and your cohort is so important, because you can really grok the whole system and then go out and do little small solutions that build on each other over time. But one of the pertinent questions I thought was, how do you finance these big projects, Zach? And what do you teach your clients? Is it like you once you're trained up, you just seek clients, you hang out a shingle on the internet or something, or how do we fund these bigger projects?
There's so many people out there that want to create good things on their land and have plenty of funding to do so. So
Mm.
our work is the vast majority in the private sector, and the vast majority funded by the landowners that are benefiting from that work.
Okay.
Um, some of our students are starting to work more in the public sector with forestry departments and things of that nature. And for example, this project I have through the Department of Defense, they have an imperative to do 500,000 acres of water retention in the American West, and they have tons of money available for it through nature-based
Yep.
solutions. So, and then even, I have colleagues that are working with foreign governments, heads of state in foreign governments.
Wow.
So there's no shortage of financing for a lot of these projects. And we're at the point where, we have way too many projects coming in and are just, can't take them all on. And that's why we started trying to train up others. Our students are a lot finding through the course, we basically guide people to do the things you need to do to get work in your area,
Okay.
give a presentation, do outreach, and that immediately leads to work. It worked for me, and that's why we teach it to others. So that really helps. And then as far as the projects in India, where this is some of the poorest people in the world, frankly.
Yep.
What they have is quite an interesting model where they have outside organizations make very small donations that then the local people cover 2/3 of the cost with their voluntary labor, and
Mm.
the outside money comes in to pay for the digger. So, for
Mm.
example, that one project that I showed, an engineering outfit paid, I think, $10,000 to $20,000 for the earth digging machine, and then all of the village people volunteered their time and their tractors and any equipment they had to help with it. So this is done by Tarun Bharat Song, and they basically take small donations and make huge works with them through
Cool.
this voluntary labor piece.
That's amazing. I gather in the Indian projects, I don't know if it's everywhere, but through Andrew Millicent's videos, that there are sort of contests within various states or whatever they may happen to be. So this is like it's sort of incentivized in a way that it's like a sport almost. It's like who can, plant the most water, who can store the most water. And then they have some period of time when all these different villages coalesce around these ideas. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, exactly. And because this work has been so successful, a Bollywood star got very inspired by it
Oh,
and
cool.
started this competition of the water cup. So this was,
The water cup.
that wasn't the beginning of it. The beginning of it was people doing it little bit by hand, all by hand, people carrying the soil in baskets on their heads. And then the neighboring villages saw how well it worked and started
Right.
copying it. And so it was
Wow.
very slow at the beginning, all voluntary labor. The first one was Rajendra digging by himself. But
Yep.
then as people saw it, he always says, the Indians, they don't believe the tongue, they believe the eye. They believe what they can see. And
Mm.
because this creates real, tangible, positive impacts for the people living there, and we see the same thing. We'll do one project in an area and then we go back and work for the neighbors and we go
Yep.
back and work for their neighbors
Totally.
because once you see it, you can't unsee it.
It's obvious that it's working. Yeah. Any luck, Topher?
No, I'm totally thwarted. I've done everything that the computer has told me to do, and
Yep.
I'm a failure.
It's not you. It's this program. Let's blame the program. But well, let's just hear a soliloquy then. You're a very eloquent speaker. Maybe you can just give us the gist of what we want to maybe learn and carry forward from Victor Schauberger's understanding of fluid dynamics.
So Victor Schauberger, I'll just make it super simple. Let me cancel this out. So Schauberger figured out very early in his hydrologist career that you wanted water to play. You wanted water to kind of tumble in on itself in a centripetal way. Because whenever water would actually fall in a centripetal motion, meaning falling inwards towards its center, just like Zach was bringing up, it starts to cool. It becomes denser. It ends up having a higher energy part to it. So he actually built this massive logging flume up in the Austrian Alps, And what he did was he made a massive egg water tank that was essentially condensing the water because he saw that the logs would float much better on a water that had a higher energy density. And then his flume looked like, something like a Jamaican bobsledding thing. Like it went down and did all these weird curves. And, the people thought in his day thought he was crazy. They're like, there's no way these massive logs with all this weight are going to be able to flow down this Jamaican bobsled thing. And it worked perfectly. And it actually, to his dismay, it worked so good that the person he was working for ended up cutting down the entire forest because they could extricate the wood so easily. But his whole principle was that when you have a centripetal flow of water, when the water is diving towards the center, and when it has a space like a flow form that it can go through where it's zigging and zagging, but in a way that concentrates. Whenever you think of centripetal, think of concentration. You get, he called it higher qualigens. I have a lot of theories. I'm sure Dr. Pollack has a lot of theories on it. I think somehow, some way, it increases the light hydrogen, the protium in the water, which does a lot of neat things. But he essentially started teaching people that, okay, Mother Nature uses the egg shape, like we from God knows how
From the
long back
egg.
in history from the egg. It's like, why does it use the egg shape? And this is like where my dome building comes into play here. Well, half of your egg, if you had an egg, just an egg shape. God, I wish I could show these pictures. So we've all seen an egg. An egg is essentially a hemisphere on the top, and then it has a pointy edge, which is a lancet arch. It's a lancet arch dome. So I decided to build these types of domes because I figured out that I'm supposed to do Victor Schauberger's water storage. It's one of my harebrained things. And so all I had to do was build a lancet arch dome and put that part in the ground, and then put a hemispherical dome, which most people are aware of what a hemisphere looks like, a regular dome, and put that on top, have my water inlet about 3/4 of the way up, and have my water outlet about a fifth of the way up from the bottom, and then you end up getting a vorticular flow pattern in the water where you need absolutely zero chemical to keep the water clean. So there's this natural temperature gradient that occurs over domes, and that's why domes are really nice to live in. Actually, is because
Yeah.
there's no dead spots in a hemispherical dome or a lancet arch dome. Now, what do I mean when I say dead spot? There's always a flow that can occur. So if you have temperature differential from, say, the sunny side, say the south side of the dome to the north side of the dome, the difference in temperature from one side to the other will have the water beget movement. Because as Dr. Pollack said, like it's picking up a charge, it's picking up a thermal charge, and that thermal charge starts to order the water, and then the water is he called it seeking dynamic disequilibrium. That's another word for syntropy. Water is always seeking syntropy. So it starts to spiral. I won't say a fully spiral because it all depends on the dome and the materials that you make. But let's just say that there's zero stagnation. And where I was in Costa Rica, it was crazy because we had all these incredible slip springs that would give us this fresh water, but everybody would store their water in boxes. And then they would
Right.
throw, then they would, all these boxes, a box has 8 dead spots, it has 8 vertices. And each one of those vertices in the box would have the most like gnarly fungus and mold and stuff that you would never wish to ever come close to your drinking water. But it was ubiquitous there because everybody just knows how to build a box. So our whole thing was the first farm I lived on there. They actually just dug a a Schauberger egg, like a lancet arch, in the ground, and then they had, they just wired up like this haphazard dome. And he said if you just put the egg shape on your property, it doesn't matter how big it is, it will imbue the property with a, he didn't call it scalar, I call it a scalar. Let's just call it a radionic signature of fertility. And whatever you wanted the property to have, you would just throw in, like say you did a soil test and your property was low on all the precious metals. Like say it was low in platinum, gold, silver, copper, whatever. You would just throw a little bit of that into your egg vessel that was buried in the ground, and all of a sudden you go get your soil tested a year later, and all those levels were higher on your property because
Okay.
he looked at it, and I actually have the answer. He just theorized, but through actually building so many of these domes and then like having like real world experimentation, we figured it out. So he was very, very like, I mean, obviously, I only read what was translated into English. There's probably, incredible amount of material that I wasn't exposed to. But what he said is you want the narrow part of the egg in the ground because the narrow part of the egg is, you could say, is like the male phallus. And the ground is negatively charged, so it's feminine. So it's the phallus inside the feminine aspect. The dome part on top, that is the hemispherical dome, is naturally female because it's a receptive. We've all seen like different types of, uh, uh, I guess you would call them transceivers, something that can project and receive information. On military vessels and stuff like that, they're always a hemisphere or a full sphere.
Right.
It's because it can receive a higher range of frequencies at that shape, right? Well, that's the feminine thing. The feminine is receiving energy, it's pulling it in. So imagine you have your receptacle, this nice hemispherical dome on top of the land that's receiving father sky energy. So the female part of the egg is receiving father sky energy. That gets, the vorticular pattern inside the egg then inseminates the egg itself, and then the male part of the phallus then distributes that energy into the female earth. It makes no sense to a person that's just like allopathic, I'll say, where one chemical input equals, one output. Like we did things in biodynamics where you take a ram's horn and you'd put some things in the ram's horn that you wanted your farm to have. You'd put it at the four corners of your farm, and then all of a sudden your farm had the results that you wanted from it. Now, how does that
Yeah.
happen? The nature, and Schauberger talked about this all the time. Nature, man in nature is this perfect syntropic system where one signals the other all the time. This is like the work that you're doing, Zach. Is like, okay, the ground is dry. Us as human goes, oh, you're dry? Let's dig a lake. Let's dig a huge pond so the water can collect. Then immediately there's a feedback loop of Mother Nature saying, yes, you heard me. You see me. And we all know how pretty women are. The second you really see them and they know that you understand them, they just start giving, right? That's exactly what this feedback loop is. And Schauberger figured out that the best way to play with water, or the best way to have respect for water, was to use these flow forms and use these egg shapes and all these things that would always allow it to move, would always allow it to play, and never let it get too hot. Because that's something that we were seeing in Costa Rica a lot, was like oh, well, it's everywhere now. When I say Costa Rica, that's just my exposure. But like you'd have these waterways, these little rivers and everything like that. They would end up clear cutting to the river, and then all the sunlight. And Dr. Pollack's work, I mean, this explains why the water will start to recede at that point. It's he was always saying, no, 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 no. The rivers are in the streams. All these things need to be protected in the foliage and the trees that would create the canopy that the water would flow under would be the transpirative protection to keep the water cool underneath. Because the longer the water could stay cool, the more it would imbue the energy, the mature energy of the deep aquifer back into the land and into the ocean. So
Jeez.
like, I mean, you talk about somebody that was so like in tune. I mean, and I'll tell you, like, I think a lot of his technology is being with and giving.
Oh, we lost you, Topher. What do you think about the egg shape, Dr. Pollack? Do you think that has any experimental value, maybe in the lab or with some students of yours? Maybe you could play with the
I
egg
wish I
shape.
could comment on that, but uh, I I don't know. I will comment on the low temperature that Schauberger had been talking about, because we found as you reduce the temperature of water, you're moving toward ice. What happens is that easy water builds, and I suspect that by lowering the temperature and easing the flow of logs, for example, down the flume, that might be what was going on. Um, and, um, Schauberger, of course, is a hero for all of us, and in fact, I know that his grandson Jörg Schauberger, who's coming to our water conference to be
Yeah.
held in Lisbon in October,
Oh,
he
cool.
built a museum of sort, and one of the things in the museum um, is his. Well, I'm not sure what he called it, but a kind of flying saucer that he built, and that
Yeah,
seems to
yeah,
have received less attention. But for me, it was the most interesting, because how did he do it? And
yeah.
so apparently, when he was recruited by the Nazis when they came to Austria, and eventually he moved to Texas, I think it was, under the auspices of the U.S. government. And I guess the secrets of that flying saucer are somewhere hidden within the confines of U.S. government archives or something like that, but we don't know about it. And for me, that was really interesting, if
That's
that occurs. So,
fascinating.
so that's my comment on Schauberger. But we're back again.
Yeah, Topher, we lost you. You look a little phased out.
We
Maybe
lost him
you
again.
come in and out. Zach, any reactions from all that gravy that Topher was laying down?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really wanting to pick Topher's brain about, because we do a lot of spring development, and I certainly see the differences, but I'd love to start integrating those egg shapes into that. It reminds me very much of, Sepp will oftentimes talk about how any living being that doesn't move dies, and that
Yes.
applies for water too. And he has this very similar water system that, to my knowledge, has never been implemented, but was designed of these egg shapes with water circulating between them as a way to have
Mm.
living water in a house or a home. So
Yes.
Topher, I'm very much wanting to get with you and pick your brain about how to integrate these egg shapes into our current spring development projects, because that makes total sense, something I've learned a lot about, but haven't been able to implement before. So yeah, I look forward to learning more from you there.
Well, here's the thing about
Yeah,
the
and
egg shapes. Here's the thing about the egg shapes that so exciting. So I got into building with ferro cement because with ferro cement I can make an exact egg. And the cool thing is, if I make an egg out of ferro cement, I can use with salt rebar instead of regular metal rebar. so
Oh yeah.
it doesn't block the telluric currents of the earth, because that's a very big deal, is to be able for the water to not be electrically disassociated from the ground. You want the telluric energy, which is essentially, if you have electricity going in this vector, magnetism goes in this direction. So
Hmm.
whatever the current of electricity in the ground is, the magnetic vector of that is known as a telluric current. And a telluric current is what Schauberger and a bunch of his cohorts were talking is about, what actually gives the ground vitality. That's where the vitality comes from. And it's actually distributed through the mineral content that's in the subsoil, the mycelium in the carbon contact in the topsoil, and the water, in the way the water is flowing through the land. And
Hmm.
so when you can build an egg, I should say it this way: I can now build an egg out of magnesium ferrocement. And when you look at, and by ferro, I mean, I know I just said I'd use basalt, but just think of ferro as the armature. That's what the cement is actually connecting to. The chemical composition of that now is very similar to a regular egg. It's mostly calcium, magnesium. It's like literally, like we could do, like he was building these things out of wood. Like we can literally make a ferro cement egg tank. And just like now, like we're breaking ground on 3 domes here next week. What I have to do for a footer system for a dome is about 1/4 of the material that is needed for a normal post and beam building of the
Right.
same size. Because post and beams buildings, they're never equal, they're never monolithic. So the way you have to build the foundation is, the foundation has to always handle shear, because the roof is always fighting the base, right? And because it's doing that, you have to overbuild this foundation. So you were talking, Zach, about the hardening of the environment. A whole reason why they have to use so many materials is because the geometry of the buildings themselves are not conducive to be strong by themselves. The geometry of these boxes, they don't do well when things shake. They don't do well when there's shear, right? So
Yeah.
when you have a dome and you have a curve, and this is the reason why nature uses curves, is because that curve in and of itself is a self-stabilizing thing. You see this in ponds. Have you ever dug a square pond?
That would be stupid.
I drew one once, just the drawing, and Seth pretty much slapped me across the face.
It, it's horrible. It's cubes. Like when you look at the cube, like the cube archetypes, the Saturnian archetypes, and where they're put in cityscapes and things like that, you can feel it's the antithesis of life. Where in
Yeah.
nature you have these beautiful flow forms and these curves. Well, when I build, it's like it's an actual thing. I get the same. Well, this is the best way I can explain it. So if you have a flat piece of a wall, right? It's a planar surface. If I put a 6-degree curve in it, now it's 6 times as strong as just a planar wall. If I put a double curve on it, like a convex, now it's 13 times as strong given the same amount of material.
Hmm.
Wow.
So you talk. That's why nature builds with curves, because it's Dr. Pollack said it earlier. It's simpler. When you have a curve, you can use less material to produce more things that are more
Yeah.
stable, and they're pretty.
and there's this and there's this 1 + 1 = 3 sort of thing that nature does, where it gives actually more using less materials. It's not just additive, it's like this multiplicative process in some way. Guys, we're coming up on 2 hours, and this is amazing. I could talk to all three of you forever, but I want to be respectful of time, and maybe we'll close this off with just the idea of, what do y'all recommend for drinking water that takes advantage of some of this, fourth phase water that we're talking about? And Jerry, I don't know that I've ever heard you talk about that, but with your research, how has that influenced what you personally drank or how you choose to store your water or anything like that?
So many people ask me what kind of water should I drink, and my answer uniformly is I don't know. And
Okay.
I can theorize that the water that contains EZ should be good for health. That's only theory, and I think it's valid. One of the problems is that you never know. Companies will advertise their water as having easy water or fourth phase water or structured water, but they rarely do they reveal the evidence about what their water contains. And I think
Yeah.
the only way to do that is to have a what NIH does often with pharmaceuticals is to have clinical trials. So, for example, you take some patients with kidney issues, and half of them drink water A, and the other half drink water B, and they do it for a year,
Mm.
and then you see what befalls them, which one, if any, does better than the other. The problem is that in our society, you know, the allopathic orientation, the word water is not in the vocabulary. So I think NIH maybe has never heard of the word water. It's not in their vocabulary. But this is really urgently what needs to be done. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely, it's kind of a no brainer about you try to convince them to do this, you know, and it could be done for a budget that's far less than the budget that goes toward checking some kind of pharmaceutical or a vaccine or
Yeah.
whatever. So um, that's my response, is that I can theorize what water might be useful, but it's only theory. You know how theories are. You know, that they can be valid, but they could also be completely invalid. And that's why
Yes.
my response is always I don't know. And I myself, the various people send me some water or deliver, and I drink most of it. I was drinking alkaline water for a period of time, and that's really popular in Japan. If you have any kind of problem, GI problem from your mouth down to your anus, they give it to you, and I think it's free. I don't know whether they give it to you in bottles or they give you the machine, but I know that they do, and that's after
Hmm.
extensive clinical trials. I get some spring waters from various colleagues that I drink, but in essence, I'm not sure of any of these, and so I
Yep.
think people can hypothesize what kind of water is really good for them, but that's it. It's a hypothesis, and
Yep.
one needs experimental evidence, and that requires money. And you know, it's not so easy to get money when you're dealing with water, and especially dealing with properties of water that many people consider weird.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I have your website as pollacklab.org. Is that the best place
Sure.
people
Yeah.
could
Absolutely.
follow up with you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here, Jerry. And Zach, what do you think with all your knowledge of water? Do you drink out of a certain vessel? How do you prefer to consume water, etc.?
Yeah, for me, I try everything I come across to just see how it makes me feel. But I always go back to just spring water from the earth. And I think there's
Yeah.
two sides of that. One is that it makes me feel good, frankly, and we're evolved to drink it. I think, uh, you know, well water oftentimes causes all these issues. Rainwater is kind of lacking a lot of things that we need. Spring water is this perfect mix of distilled by the sun, mineralized and charged by the earth. Then the other piece that I really like about spring water is that the spring produces what it can sustainably. You can't overdraft
Hmm.
a spring if you develop it correctly. It just will stop producing when it doesn't have enough water. Whereas a well, you can very much
Hmm.
overdraw. And there is a neglected mega crisis going on right now with groundwater over extraction, where I'm working for farmers that are saying in 6 years they're going to be out of water. by the estimates that they have, because they're
Gosh.
entirely dependent on groundwater aquifers that are going dry. And so, one, from the health, but two, from the sustainability standpoint, spring water is the water that nature freely provides to us in a non-extractive form. And that's why I always go back to spring water.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And waterstories.com is the best place for people to follow up with you and stay in touch.
Yep, totally. We've
Awesome.
got a bunch of films, stories, a whole community, waterstories.com.
Amazing. Thank you, Zach. And what about you, Topher? You drink out of eggs or what?
I do. I do. I vortex my water. I'm a vortexing nut. So Dr.
Yeah.
Pollack, I actually sent your lab in 2013 one of my experimental devices, and I never heard back from the University of Washington because I wanted your stamp of approval. I wanted you to tell me that I was doing it right. But I've done everything with water. I've done everything with water that you could think of. Currently, I'll just tell you what I currently have. I bought a piece of property that has an artesian spring. Um, 8 months out of the year, it's overflowing. So I go out and I literally just fill my hands. Our hands are the perfect flow form.
Yeah.
I'll fill my hands and drink, because there's something about having like the full experience of it. Um, I do that when that's not appropriate. I'll fill water bottles with it. That water feeds my house. In my house, I have something that's considered a reverse osmosis system, but it's not really because I've modified it greatly. I've taken out all the filters that they give me. They give a lot of paper filters, and I've replaced that with biochar. I make biochar, and Dr. Pollack, at some point, I need to have you on my podcast to talk about diamagnetism and water, because we just have to nerd out about that. So I'll send water through essentially two, I think by volume, they're 20-gallon uh, full of biochar, which is pyrolyzed carbon. And that highly diamagnetic water then goes through a system of ring magnets that are phase conjugated, meaning I force the ring magnets together. They're same poles together, which creates something called scalar north. That water goes through my whole system, and that's what we shower in. That's what we drink. And then I
Mm.
also have like have you guys seen the Mayu Vortexer?
Yeah.
I have one of those Mayu Vortexers just because I think it's really pretty. And
I think so
kids
too.
love it. Kids love it because it's that egg shape, it's that Schauberger egg shape. I've actually talked to the inventor of that. Um, oh, are you guys still there?
Yeah.
Yep. I still hear you.
You're still there? Okay, good. So
Yep.
that I always have that vortexing. Of course, I can't leave well enough alone. I've been trying to get them to change their impeller design. So I've been 3D printing and having people in my team actually. You're gonna laugh at this, Dr. Pollack. I actually took a version of the Lily impeller, and I've been trying to get Nafion to spray on it, so I could spray Nafion, so I could have that semi-permeable membrane as I vortexes with the impeller. Right now, it's out of commission. I'm looking at it over there in my chest of experiments. But I will get there. I'll get it so that I get a version of the Lily impeller vortexing with the NAFI on there to really. I want to see like a super vortex in there. I want the RPMs up,
Um,
if you know what I mean. I really
can
want I want a cooler water.
can I just make one remark in response to what you're saying? You know, vortex water, it should correspond to living water, um, from Victor Schauberger. But we were curious to see if that water, the so-called living water, is actually EZ water, and
Yeah.
and it's really hard to find any evidence that when you vortex the water, I mean, really credible experiments that demonstrate that. And we've just begun, and we have a vortex which is similar to what you just showed. So far, the results are looking positive. I can't say anything at the moment, but this is one of the areas where people presume something, but the evidence for that is lacking. So if the subsequent experiments turn out, that will be great. And just about magnets, we've been studying magnets, and it turns out that magnets create easy water. Um,
Yes.
we just published a paper on that. We're studying it further, so that's another area of interest. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take the wind out of your sails, but I had to comment on
No,
that.
you. I'm so pumped, man. You made my whole body full of easy water. I'm so stoked.
Oh, then you're extremely healthy.
So check this out. Okay, God, there's so many different directions I want to go. So I deal a lot because I don't have a lab. I don't know how to look at all this stuff. I use anecdotal experience. All right. One thing I've watched, if I vortex water, my animals will always choose the vortexed water over the non-vortexed water.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've
Okay.
heard that as well.
it's really
I
interesting.
have I have very, very powerful cone magnets. I actually have the most powerful cone magnets in the world where they're a 2-inch base, they're a perfect cone, they're southern polarization. I use that on my clients to actually find spots in their body that are out of whack. It works without fail. And when I just pull the magnets out, my animals will come to me. They
Hmm.
know, like, how an animal will, like, if they're injured, they'll just go dig into the earth and like kind of burrow and just allow the telluric currents of they don't have intellect. It's just instinctual. They'll just go to whatever will help them, whatever will heal them. So I see that with my animals, and I also see it with little kids. Little kids, at least in the generation of little kids that, my daughter's almost 4 years old, they never want to drink water, ever. You vortex some water without even letting them see it. So it's not like it's a game in their mind of, ooh, I get to drink the vortexy water. I've done this with my daughter is I'll vortex water before she wakes up, and then I'll just put some cups out. She'll always instinctively grab the vortex water and
Wow,
and not grab,
wow.
and she doesn't ever want to drink water unless it's vortex. So I've
Hmm.
actually made my wife, I grew up in Florida. Part of this is me releasing my South Florida karma because in South Florida, they pump the aquifer full of all of the excrement from people because the water
Oh,
table is so low. And they say, "Oh,
right.
don't worry about it. We got chemicals. We'll just clean it." But the water quality is so low that in South Florida, the skin quality of people is horrible. Like I'm a testament to
Mm.
that. So when I started massaging my Scandinavian clients that would come, these snowbirds that would come from Scandinavia, I was like a eugenicist. I was like, how are your guys' skins so perfect? They all did sauna, and they all lived in little towns where they had these cisterns from these very, very old springs. Like these springs were filling these cisterns, so they had this great water that they were drinking. And you could tell their skin was like butter. It was so perfect. And all of us South Floridians, we got moles and like are, spotted and all this stuff. And it was crazy because when I moved to an area that had pristine water, all these like little skin tags and things like that were on my body just within a few years fell off. Like they just
Mm.
fall off because the structured water in the easy, like the whole easy environment of always having that thermal gain and everything like that completely changed my biology. I
Wow.
shouldn't say changed my biology. I should enhanced it. So like
Yeah.
and the one thing I didn't tell you about my water system is I changed the, how people will use what's that form of light that most people use to get rid of bacteria?
UV.
UV. I changed that to red light because of your
Oh,
work,
okay.
Dr. Pollack. Because
Oh,
I read
wow.
you, I was like, I want to add the structuring effect of the red light of the far infrared to the
Yeah.
water. So I also do that to our water.
That's fantastic. Well, without let's pause here and we'll wrap up this chapter in our story. And maybe you guys we can continue at some other point, or we can bring on other interesting thinkers and experimenters in the water world. I would love to have all of you on as individuals to give your full attention to you, because you all deserve it. But I think this was a really stimulating conversation. I hope you all enjoyed being here.
Yeah.
And Topher, is it topherhq.com? Is that the best place for folks to go?
Yes, you can see some of my construction work there. I do a lot of building and consulting with building. You know, I would like to do what, Mr. Weiss is doing all the time, but I'm also building structures at the moment. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, gentlemen, you all are an inspiration to all of us. Thanks again for being here, everybody. I much appreciate your time, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you
thank
for
you.
organizing, and thank you both for the great work you guys are doing.
Well,
It was
okay.
it was a blast to meet you both. Thank you for
Yeah,
your guys' work, and thank
likewise. Absolutely. So we'll see you.
Yep.
Um,
See
how
you down the road, everybody.
okay. Bye bye.